The Blacktown car eased to a stop on Tremont Street, and Evelyn Carter's hand froze on the door handle before she even registered why. Through the tinted window, past the steam rising off the grates near Park Street Station, she saw it, a flash of deep blue light catching the grey Boston morning, dangling from the neck of a woman wrapped in 3 mismatched coats, sitting on a flattened cardboard box with a paper cup in front of her. For 8 years, Evelyn had carried a photograph of that exact necklace in her wallet, the sapphire pendant shaped like a teardrop, the platinum chain custom forged by a jeweler in Geneva who had sworn there was no other like it in the world. She had buried an empty casket because of that necklace. She had told a courtroom, an army of reporters, and finally herself, that her daughter was gone because the only physical trace of Olivia Carter that ever surfaced after that weekend in Maine was a single security camera frame showing that pendant glinting at a gas station 40 minutes from where she vanished. And now it was here, in the unwashed hands of a woman the city had forgotten, 2 blocks from Faneuil Hall, as if it had simply been waiting for her to notice. "Stop the car," Evelyn said, and her voice did not sound like her own. Marcus, her driver of 11 years, glanced in the mirror, sensing something had shifted in the air of the cabin. "Mrs. Carter, the board meeting starts in 20 minutes, the Whitfield acquisition vote." "Stop the car, Marcus." She was already reaching for the door, her knuckles white against the handle, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her security chief, a broad-shouldered former Army officer named Daniel Brooks, was out before she was, scanning the sidewalk with the practiced eyes of a man who had spent 2 decades keeping wealthy people safe from a world that wanted pieces of them. He saw what she was looking at and his jaw tightened. "Ma'am, let me handle this. Stay in the car." "No." Evelyn stepped onto the sidewalk in her charcoal Armani coat, her heels clicking against frozen concrete, and crouched in front of the homeless woman before Daniel could stop her, ignoring the cold biting through her wool coat, ignoring the small crowd of morning commuters who slowed to stare. Up close, the woman was younger than Evelyn had expected, maybe 40, with sharp green eyes that held no fear, only a calm, searching curiosity, as though she were the one studying Evelyn rather than the other way around. "That necklace," Evelyn said, and her hand trembled as she pointed to it, her perfectly manicured finger shaking in a way it never did during hostile takeovers or congressional testimony. "Where did you get that necklace?" The woman touched the pendant instinctively, protectively, the way a person touches something that has become part of them, something woven into the rhythm of their own heartbeat. "It's mine," she said simply. "Has been for years." "It is not yours." Evelyn's voice cracked, the careful boardroom composure she had spent 2 decades building dissolving in an instant, right there on a public sidewalk in front of strangers, with phones already starting to rise. "That necklace was made for my daughter. It was made for Olivia. There is no other one like it on earth. I have the design specifications. I have the receipts. I have 8 years of grief tied to that exact sapphire." Daniel stepped forward, his hand drifting toward his jacket, his instincts already cataloguing exits and threats. "Ma'am, did you steal this? I need you to answer honestly, right now." "I didn't steal anything from anybody in my life," the woman said, and there was no anger in her voice, only a tired, steady patience, as if she had defended herself against worse accusations many times before, accusations that came with every winter she'd spent on these streets. "My name is Grace Miller. I've had this necklace for almost 6 years. A man gave it to me before he died, said it belonged to somebody whose story wasn't finished." Evelyn felt the sidewalk tilt beneath her, the whole city seeming to lean sideways for one disorienting second. "Whose story wasn't finished?" she repeated, the words tasting strange in her mouth. "What does that mean? Who told you that? Tell me his name." "His name was Walter," Grace said, her voice softening with something like fondness. "Walter Hayes. He used to come by the shelter on Albany Street with sandwiches for everybody, every single week, rain or snow. Didn't matter if it was 90 degrees or 10 below. Quiet man. Sad eyes, the kind that had seen things he never talked about. One night he got real sick, ended up at the charity ward over at St. Bridget's, and I was the only one who came to visit him, because nobody else seemed to know he existed. Nobody else seemed to remember a man who'd spent years feeding strangers. Before he passed, He took this off his own neck and put it in my hands. Said, "Somebody's going to come looking for this one day. When they do, you'll know. Give it to them and only them." "And you've kept it this whole time," Evelyn said, disbelief and something almost like awe creeping into her voice. "You never tried to sell it? Pawn it? Anything?" "Lady, I've gone 2 days without eating before. I've slept in doorways in February with my hands turning blue. I've watched people walk past me like I wasn't even a person." Grace's eyes glistened for the first time, a crack appearing in that steady calm. "I could have pawned this 100 times over and never had to worry about a roof again, never had to worry about anything again. But it wasn't mine to sell. It was mine to keep safe. That's all. A promise is a promise, even to a man who's already gone." Evelyn reached into her coat and pulled out a checkbook, her hands shaking so badly the pen nearly slipped from her fingers onto the sidewalk. "I will give you anything. A house, security, more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. A trust fund, a foundation in your name, whatever you want. Just please, please tell me everything you know about where this came from." Grace looked at the checkbook, then back at Evelyn's face, studying her the way someone studies a person in real pain rather than a person performing it, and gently pushed the pen away with one weathered finger. "I already told you everything I know. I never met your daughter. Never heard her name before today in my entire life. I don't want your money, ma'am. I want you to believe me." Daniel pulled Evelyn aside, his voice low and urgent, his hand still hovering near his jacket. "This is exactly the kind of person who preys on grief, Mrs. Carter. Think about it logically. She probably found that necklace somewhere, recognized the design from the news coverage 8 years ago when it was on every front page in New England, and has been waiting years for the right moment to cash in on a story like this." "Then why didn't she sell it already?" Evelyn snapped, louder than she intended, drawing more stares from the gathering crowd. "Why didn't she take the money I just offered her right now, on this sidewalk, with no one forcing her hand?" Daniel had no answer. He simply stood there, jaw tight, watching the woman who refused free money like it offended her. Evelyn looked back at Grace, who hadn't moved an inch, who was simply watching her with that same unsettling calm, and something in Evelyn's chest, some instinct sharpened by decades of reading liars across negotiating tables in boardrooms from Boston to Singapore, told her this woman was not one of them. "I'm not calling the police," Evelyn said quietly, almost to herself. "Not yet." That night, Evelyn sat alone in the study of her Beacon Hill townhouse, the same room where she had once helped 12-year-old Olivia with algebra homework, at the very desk where she now sat. The same room where, 8 years later, federal agents had spread case files across her grandmother's mahogany surface and told her gently that hope was a kindness they could no longer responsibly offer her. She opened the bottom drawer of that desk and removed a manila folder she hadn't touched in 3 years, her fingers hesitating on the worn edges. Inside was the original case file from the Maine State Police, copies of FBI reports stamped with case numbers she still remembered by heart, and one photograph. Olivia, at 17, laughing on a dock in Camden, the sapphire necklace glinting at her throat, a gift from her father before the cancer took him. The last piece of him Evelyn had been able to give their daughter before he was gone too. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she made a decision that would have horrified her board of directors, her lawyers, and certainly Daniel Brooks. She would not bring in the police, not yet. Not until she understood what Grace Miller actually was. So instead, she did something far more unusual for a woman who controlled a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire spanning 4 continents. She decided to follow her. For 4 days in a plain sedan with tinted windows, parked far enough away that Grace would never notice, Evelyn watched, cancelling meetings, lying to her own executive assistant about a sudden family matter requiring her attention. She watched Grace wake before dawn under the overpass near the South Bay on-ramp, wrapped in those same mismatched coats, and walk 3 miles in bitter cold to a shelter on Albany Street, not for herself, but to help serve breakfast to people far worse off than she was, ladling oatmeal with a kind of focused tenderness Evelyn had rarely seen even among her own highly paid philanthropic staff. She watched Grace give her own donated gloves, the only pair she owned, to a teenage boy who'd run away from a group home in Worcester, then spend an hour convincing him, with nothing but patience and a few dollars of hot coffee from a corner shop, to call his social worker instead of disappearing into the city for good. where worse things waited for boys like him. She watched Grace sit beside an elderly veteran outside the VA clinic on Causeway Street for 2 hours in the cold. Just listening to him talk about a war he'd fought decades earlier, asking nothing in return, offering only her presence. She watched a woman who had every reason in the world to be bitter, to be hardened, to take whatever she could grab from a city that had clearly failed her at every turn, and instead choose kindness, again and again, in moments no one was even there to witness or reward. On the 5th day, Evelyn could not stay in the car any longer. She got out, walked to the bench where Grace was sitting near the common, watching pigeons scatter across frost-covered grass, and sat down beside her without a word, her expensive coat looking suddenly absurd against the worn wooden slats. Grace didn't look surprised. "You've been following me," she said, not turning her head. "Yes. For days. 4, to be exact." Evelyn's voice was quiet, almost ashamed. Grace finally turned to look at her, and there was the faintest trace of a smile, sad and knowing, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had long ago stopped expecting fairness from the world. "Took you long enough to figure out I wasn't lying." "I had to be sure," Evelyn said, her composure finally cracking completely. "I've spent 8 years being lied to by people who wanted my money, private investigators who fabricated leads just to keep their retainers, a psychic who told me Olivia was alive on a beach in California, living happily, no memory of me at all, and charged me $4,000 for that cruelty. Reporters who chased my grief for ratings, camping outside this very house. I had to be sure you weren't one more person doing that to me, because I don't think I could survive being wrong again. And now? Now I think you might be the only honest thing that's happened to me in 8 years." Evelyn's voice broke on the last word, and for the first time since the morning at Park Street Station, she let herself cry in front of a stranger, right there on a public bench, mascara running, billionaire composure utterly gone. "I need you to help me find this man, Walter Hayes. I need to know everything about him, where he came from, what he knew, why he had my daughter's necklace around his neck before he died." Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching a flock of pigeons rise and resettle. "I don't know much, honestly. He never talked about his past, not really, not the parts that mattered. But I know he used to volunteer driving a medical transport van years back, before he got too sick to work anymore. And I remember he had a tattoo on his forearm, some kind of unit number, military, I think, faded blue ink against old skin. He never talked about that either. Some men carry their whole lives folded up small enough that nobody else can see the creases. It wasn't much, but it was a thread, and Evelyn Carter had not had a thread to pull on in 8 years. She hired Sarah Collins, a retired FBI agent who had spent 15 years working violent crimes out of the Boston field office before retiring to run her own small investigative firm in Cambridge after a divorce and a shooting that still ached in damp weather. Sarah was sharp, skeptical, and entirely unimpressed by wealth, which was exactly why Evelyn wanted her, exactly why she'd turned down 2 more polished firms with glossier offices and worse instincts. Within a week, Sarah had traced Walter Hayes' military service record. He had served 2 tours as an Army medic in his 20s, then spent 30 years working as a civilian paramedic across 3 different counties in Maine and Massachusetts, before retiring quietly to Boston, where, according to hospital intake records, he had checked himself into St. Bridget's charity ward under significant financial hardship 4 years after that. A man who had spent his whole life saving others and somehow ended up dying with nothing. But there was a gap. A 6-month period 8 years ago, exactly overlapping the weekend Olivia disappeared, during which Walter Hayes' employment records showed no activity at all. No shifts logged, no paychecks issued, as though for 6 months he had simply vanished from his own life, swallowed by some silence no payroll system could explain. "People don't just disappear from payroll systems for 6 months and come back like nothing happened," Sarah said, spreading printouts across Evelyn's dining table late one evening, the chandelier above them throwing soft light over documents that felt anything but soft. "Either he was suspended, which there's no record of anywhere, or someone scrubbed his file clean." "Scrubbed it," Evelyn repeated, the word landing heavy. "Who has the power to scrub a paramedic's employment file? That's not nothing. That takes access, money, motive." "That's the question," Sarah said, sliding over a faded photocopy with the careful precision of someone who'd learned long ago not to let her hands shake, even when the discovery underneath them was enormous. And here's a better one. Look at this. It was an incident report from a rural hospital in Rockport, Maine, dated 3 days after Olivia's disappearance. It documented the admission of an unidentified Jane Doe, approximately 17 to 19 years old, suffering from a head injury and hypothermia, found near the coastline by a fisherman checking his lobster traps before dawn. The attending paramedic listed on the transport was Walter Hayes. Evelyn's hands went cold around the paper, the dining room suddenly feeling enormous and distant. This is 3 days after. The official timeline says Olivia disappeared on the night of the 11th. This is dated the 14th. There's more, Sarah said, her voice careful now, the way professionals speak when they know they're about to detonate something inside a person they've grown to genuinely respect. The Jane Doe was transferred the same night to a private medical facility, not a state hospital, a private one, the kind that exists specifically so wealthy families can keep things quiet, paid for in full, in cash by an anonymous party. After that, there's no further record of her in any system I can access. She simply disappears from the paper trail completely, like she was erased rather than discharged. Someone paid to make a Jane Doe disappear, Evelyn whispered, the chandelier light suddenly too bright. 3 days after my daughter vanished. From a hospital 40 minutes from where her necklace was photographed at a gas station. Tell me that's not a coincidence, Sarah. Tell me. I'm not saying it was Olivia, Sarah said quickly, holding up a steadying hand. I want to be very clear with you, Evelyn, because I've seen families destroy themselves chasing hope that wasn't real. There were hundreds of missing girls that summer along that coastline. Runaways, accidents, things that had nothing to do with your daughter. This could be a coincidence. But it could not be, Evelyn said, her voice hardening into something almost like the boardroom version of herself again, the version that had built an empire. And for 8 years, nobody has given me a single thread that could not be a coincidence. This is the first one. I'm not letting it go. The private facility, it turned out, had closed 9 years ago, and its remaining patient records had been transferred to a regional archive in Augusta, buried under bureaucracy and budget cuts. It took Sarah 3 weeks, 2 formal records requests that nearly went nowhere, and one very expensive favor called in from a contact still inside the bureau to get access. What she found waiting in a banker's box marked only with a case number made her drive straight to Beacon Hill at 11 at night, rather than wait for morning, breaking 3 different traffic laws on the way. There's a discharge form, Sarah said, sitting across from Evelyn in the same study where the original case file had once destroyed her hope, the manila folder still sitting open on the desk between them like a wound that had never properly closed. 6 months after admission, the patient was discharged into the custody of a legal guardian. No name listed for the patient herself, which is unusual, deliberately unusual. But the guardian's signature is here. She turned the page around with the gravity of someone handing over a weapon. Evelyn read the name and felt the floor disappear beneath her entirely, the whole room tilting the way the sidewalk had tilted outside Park Street Station 5 weeks earlier. It was the signature of Richard Whitfield, vice chairman of the board of Carter Holdings, her late husband's oldest business partner and closest friend, a man who had sat beside her at Olivia's empty funeral and held her hand through every devastating year since, who had sent flowers every single anniversary of the disappearance, who had cried, actually cried, real tears at the memorial service. That's impossible, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard has been like family to me. He helped fund the private investigation. He has spent 8 years grieving alongside me, Sarah. I watched him grieve. I held his hand while he cried. I'm only telling you what the document says, Sarah replied gently, though her own expression had gone carefully neutral in a way that told Evelyn she already suspected far worse. I'm not telling you what it means yet. Documents can have explanations we haven't found. What it meant took another 2 devastating weeks to surface, and it nearly cost Sarah Collins her life to find it. She tracked down a retired nurse from the private facility, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, now living outside Portland, in a small house with a garden she'd been proud of for 15 years, who, after considerable hesitation and a great deal of reassurance over 2 separate visits, finally admitted that she remembered the Jane Doe vividly, because the girl had severe amnesia from her head trauma and could not remember her own name for months. Only fragments, dreams, a feeling of cold water, and someone's hand slipping away from hers. Patricia remembered something else too. A man who visited the patient regularly, always alone, always paying for everything in cash through an intermediary lawyer who never gave his name, who once let slip in a moment of stress, pacing the hallway outside the patient's room, that the girl could never resurface, not as who she used to be, or it would destroy everything he had built over 30 years. 2 days after that interview, Patricia Nguyen's house caught fire in the middle of the night. She survived badly shaken, pulled out by a neighbor who smelled smoke, but the fire was later ruled arson by the local fire marshal, and the only physical copies of her old employment records, the ones that might have confirmed who had actually paid those medical bills, burned along with her garage and everything stored inside it. "Someone is cleaning up," Sarah told Evelyn over the phone that night, her voice tight with the particular fury of a former agent watching evidence destroyed in real time, watching a witness nearly killed for telling the truth. Someone with money, with reach, and with a great deal to lose if this surfaces. This isn't paranoia anymore, Evelyn. This is a pattern. Grace, who by then had moved into a small guest apartment above Evelyn's carriage house, at Evelyn's insistence and against Grace's own stubborn protests that she didn't need charity, that she'd survived fine on her own for years and didn't intend to become anyone's project, sat with them at the table that night quieter than usual, picking at a piece of bread without eating it. "What if she's not your daughter at all?" Grace finally asked, the question hanging heavy in the warm kitchen air. "What if you're about to tear apart your whole life, risk everything for somebody else's missing girl who just happened to wear a similar necklace?" "Then I will have helped find someone else's daughter," Evelyn said, meeting Grace's eyes steadily. "And that will still matter. That will still be worth everything I have." It was Grace, in fact, who provided the next breakthrough, though she didn't realize its significance until weeks later, in the way small kindnesses often turn out to carry enormous weight nobody could have predicted. While helping serve dinner at the Albany Street shelter one evening, falling back into old routines, because sitting still in Evelyn's grand townhouse made her restless in ways she couldn't quite name, she struck up a conversation with an elderly former custodian, a gentleman named Frank, who came in twice a week for a hot meal and company. Frank mentioned, almost in passing, while complaining about his knees, that the man had once worked decades earlier at a private boarding school in Camden, Maine, the very town where Olivia had vanished. He mentioned, half in passing, that he remembered a wealthy family pulling their daughter from that school abruptly 9 years before, under strange circumstances, paying an enormous settlement to keep the matter quiet after rumors had spread among the staff that the girl had become inconveniently entangled with the much older son of a business associate of her father's. Grace nearly let the comment slide past her, the way 100 small stories slide past in a sheltered dining hall every night. But something about it nagged at her on the walk home, and she mentioned it to Evelyn almost as an afterthought over breakfast the next morning. Evelyn nearly dismissed it as irrelevant until Sarah cross-referenced the dates with the kind of methodical patience that had made her exceptional at her old job, and discovered the family in question was the Whitfields. Richard Whitfield's son, Michael Reed Whitfield, had been 26 at the time, already a rising executive at a hedge fund in New York, and the girl involved had been a 16-year-old student named Olivia Carter, enrolled at that boarding school against her own wishes during a difficult stretch in her parents' marriage. Evelyn had never known. Olivia had never told her, not once, not in any of their late-night talks, not in any letter home. There had been no scandal in any newspaper, no whisper at any dinner party, because Richard Whitfield had buried it completely, the way wealthy men bury things they cannot afford to let surface, with money, lawyers, non-disclosure agreements, and a silence so total it had simply ceased to exist in any record Evelyn had ever seen. "He was involved with my daughter when she was 16 years old, Evelyn said, the words tasting like poison in her mouth, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. And 2 years later she disappeared, and he sat in my living room every single year since, drinking my wine, telling me he believed she was gone, holding my hand at her funeral. 8 years, Sarah. 8 years of that man's hands in mine. We still don't know that Michael Whitfield was responsible for what happened in Maine, Sarah cautioned, though her own voice had lost some of its careful neutrality by now. We know there was a relationship the family wanted hidden. That's a motive for secrecy. It is not yet proof of a crime. We have to be precise here, Evelyn, or we lose everything in court. The proof, when it finally surfaced, came from the last place anyone expected, Walter Hayes' own handwriting. Grace remembered in a flash one sleepless night that Walter had once mentioned keeping a journal during his final year, something he'd started in the charity ward when he knew his time was running short. So somebody would know the truth even after I couldn't tell it myself, he'd told her, half delirious with fever one evening. A volunteer chaplain at St. Brigid's, after considerable persuasion and the promise that nothing illegal had occurred on the hospital's part, finally agreed to dig through years of forgotten belongings, eventually retrieving a small water-damaged notebook from the facility's unclaimed belongings storage, where it had sat forgotten on a dusty shelf for nearly 4 years, mistaken for trash a dozen times, and somehow never thrown away. In careful, shaking handwriting that grew weaker toward the final pages, Walter Hayes had documented everything. How he'd responded to a call near Rockport Harbor the night of the 11th, finding a young woman badly injured at the base of a coastal bluff, having apparently fallen or been pushed, during a confrontation that left rocks and broken branches scattered across the scene. How Michael Whitfield had arrived at the scene minutes after Walter, panicked, his expensive shoes soaked through with seawater, begging him not to call it in as an accident, claiming the girl had simply slipped during an argument and he feared being blamed for something he swore he hadn't intended. How Richard Whitfield, summoned in the night by a phone call that would haunt every choice he made afterward, had arrived within hours with cash, lawyers already on retainer for exactly this kind of emergency, and a plan already half-formed, transferring the unconscious, unidentified girl to a private facility before any official report could be filed, paying off the responding officers with envelopes that changed 2 men's lives forever, falsifying the timeline with the careful precision of men who had done this kind of cleanup before, and ensuring that by morning, the official search for Olivia Carter would be centered 40 miles away from where she actually lay in a private room, fighting for her life with no memory of her own name, while a mother 40 miles away walked the actual beach where her daughter had supposedly vanished, calling a name into wind that would never carry it back to her. Walter had gone along with it at first, frightened and financially desperate after a divorce had drained his savings, accepting money to keep silent, telling himself the girl would recover, would remember, would somehow find her way home regardless. But as the months passed and he watched a grieving mother on the local news beg for any information about her missing daughter, her face hollowed out by sleeplessness, his conscience had broken him slowly, the way guilt breaks honest men over time, rather than all at once. He had tried twice to tell someone, once a priest, once a lawyer friend from his army days, and twice he had been threatened into silence by men working for Richard Whitfield, men who made it very clear what would happen to a man with no savings and a bad heart if he opened his mouth again. Finally, dying and with nothing left to lose, no family left to protect, no savings left to threaten, he had taken the one piece of physical proof he still possessed, the necklace the girl had been wearing the night he found her, hidden for years inside a coffee can in his apartment, and given it to the one person in the city he trusted absolutely to do the right thing with it, Grace Miller. "She survived," Evelyn whispered, reading the final pages with Sarah and Grace beside her at the kitchen table, the journal's water-stained pages trembling slightly in her hands. Olivia survived that night. She survived, and someone hid her away like she was an inconvenience instead of a person. "Evelyn," Sarah said carefully, watching her friend's face for the cracks she knew were coming, "the journal says she had amnesia. It says she eventually regained partial memory, enough to be frightened, enough that the Whitfields considered her, quote, a permanent risk requiring permanent management." Walter doesn't write what happened to her after that. The entries stop abruptly, mid-sentence almost, like something interrupted him. The final entries in Walter's journal, dated just 2 weeks before his death, contained one last devastating note: that Richard Whitfield had recently arranged for the young woman, now going by a new identity the family had carefully constructed for her over months, complete with forged documents and a fabricated childhood, to be relocated overseas under the supervision of caretakers loyal only to him, far from Boston, far from any record, living a manufactured life under a manufactured name, told that her family did not want her back, that returning would destroy everyone she loved, a lie so cruel it had kept a daughter from her own mother for years out of nothing but manufactured shame. It took another agonizing month, the FBI now formally involved, after Sarah quietly alerted a former colleague to the documented evidence of a cover-up implicating a sitting corporate vice chairman, an investigation that moved with the maddening slowness of federal bureaucracy even when lives hung in the balance, before investigators tracked the relocated identity to a quiet coastal town outside Lisbon, Portugal, where a woman calling herself Ana Reyes had lived for 6 years, working at a small bookshop near the water, telling neighbors only that she had no family, that her past was something she preferred not to discuss, that sometimes she had dreams of a city with cobblestone streets that didn't match anywhere she'd ever consciously visited, and a harbor smell that made her cry for reasons she couldn't explain. When Evelyn Carter flew to Lisbon, she did not bring lawyers or security or cameras, against the strong advice of nearly everyone around her. She brought only a single photograph, the one of Olivia laughing on a dock in Camden, wearing a sapphire necklace, and Grace Miller, who had insisted on coming despite never having held a passport before in her life, who said quietly on the plane, gripping the armrest through turbulence with white knuckles, "I think Walter wanted it to end this way." With the necklace coming full circle, back to where it started, carried by the same hands that carried it for him. The bookshop was small, golden afternoon light slanting through dusty windows onto shelves crowded with second-hand novels, and the woman behind the counter looked up when the door opened, her expression polite, professional, utterly unaware that the woman standing in the doorway had spent 8 years grieving her as dead. For a long suspended moment, nothing happened, the small bell above the door still echoing faintly in the quiet shop. Then Evelyn stepped forward, her hands shaking, and placed the photograph gently on the counter between them. The woman looked down at it. Her breath caught audibly. Her hand rose slowly to her own collarbone, where a faint, pale scar traced the same place a teardrop pendant had once rested against her skin every single day of her childhood, a scar she had touched 1,000 times without knowing why. "I don't understand," she whispered, her accented English faltering. "I don't know why, but I feel like I know this picture. I feel like I should be crying right now, and I don't understand why." "Your name is Olivia Carter," Evelyn said, tears streaming freely down her face for the first time in 8 years, without shame, without composure, without the careful armor she had worn through 1,000 business meetings and funerals and false leads and psychic frauds and empty caskets. "And I am your mother, and I have been looking for you since the night you disappeared. I never stopped, not for one single day." What followed was not instantaneous, not a fairy tale reunion sealed in a single embrace, because 8 years and a manufactured identity and a traumatic brain injury do not dissolve in a moment, no matter how much love is waiting on the other side of it. There were months of therapy back in Boston, of careful memory work with specialists who understood trauma-induced amnesia, of small fragments slowly returning in unpredictable bursts, a childhood bedroom with yellow curtains, a father's laugh echoing from some kitchen, the specific weight of a necklace against her throat on summer mornings. But the recognition was real, undeniable, confirmed within days by DNA testing that the Whitfield family, once cornered by federal investigators armed with Walter Hayes's journal, Sarah Collins's exhaustive documentation, and the testimony of the relocated caretakers, who quickly turned against Richard Whitfield to save their own lighter sentences, could no longer hide behind money or silence the way they had for nearly a decade. Richard Whitfield was indicted on charges of conspiracy, obstruction, and unlawful confinement. Michael Whitfield, who investigators determined had indeed caused Olivia's fall during a confrontation after she threatened to expose their relationship to her mother, faced charges far more serious, the kind that ended careers and futures alike. The empire of quiet influence the Whitfield family had built over 3 generations of careful marriages and careful silence collapsed within a single fiscal quarter, and Carter Holdings, under Evelyn's furious and very public restructuring, severed every remaining tie, scrubbing the Whitfield name from buildings, scholarships, and boardroom plaques alike. The trial itself stretched across 11 grueling weeks the following winter, and Evelyn made the hardest decision of the entire ordeal, against the advice of nearly every lawyer she employed, to let Olivia decide for herself whether she wanted to testify. Olivia chose to. On the stand, in a quiet, steady voice that surprised even the prosecutors who had spent months preparing her, she described fragments that had slowly resurfaced through painstaking therapy. The argument on the bluff, after she'd told Michael she intended to tell her mother everything about their relationship and end it for good. The moment his hand closed around her wrist harder than he meant to, or claimed he meant to. The fall through cold air, the shock of water and stone. And then nothing. Until a stranger's worried face leaned over her in the back of an ambulance, asking her name and receiving only frightened silence in return, a silence that would stretch into 8 stolen years. Michael Whitfield was convicted of aggravated assault and unlawful imprisonment. Richard Whitfield, facing the heavier conspiracy and obstruction charges that came from years of methodical cover-up, received 22 years without parole eligibility. His son received 14. The fallout reached further than even Sarah Collins had anticipated when she first opened that banker's box in Augusta. 2 of the responding Maine state troopers from that original night, men who had quietly accepted Whitfield money to redirect the search radius away from Rockport Harbor and toward the wrong stretch of coastline entirely, were identified through banking records Sarah had subpoenaed during the federal investigation, and both lost their badges and faced their own indictments within the year. The private facility's former administrator, long retired and comfortable in a gated community outside Bar Harbor, was charged with falsifying medical records and obstruction of justice, and in a moment of poetic justice that Sarah savored more than she probably should have admitted out loud over drinks with Evelyn one evening, it was that same administrator who finally led investigators to a storage unit in Augusta, containing the original unaltered admission records, the ones that confirmed every single detail of Walter Hayes's journal, down to the exact hour Olivia had been brought through those doors with no name and no memory. Daniel Brooks, who had once warned Evelyn that Grace was exactly the kind of person who preyed on grieving families, never quite forgave himself for that first assessment, though Grace, true to her nature, refused to let him carry the guilt for long. "You were doing your job," she told him one evening at the carriage house, setting a plate of dinner in front of him without being asked, the way she had taken to doing for half the household by then, whether they wanted mothering or not. "Protecting her from people like me is exactly what she paid you for. Turns out, I just wasn't the threat you were looking for." Daniel, gruff and unaccustomed to being forgiven so easily, only nodded and ate his dinner in silence. But from that day forward, he treated Grace less like a stranger Evelyn had taken in off the street, and more like family that had simply arrived later than the rest of them, family nonetheless. Sarah Collins, for her part, found that the Carter case had reignited something in her she thought retirement had quietly extinguished years earlier. She expanded her small Cambridge firm within the year, hiring 2 younger investigators, both women who'd left the bureau disillusioned by exactly the kind of institutional inertia that had let a case like Olivia's go cold in the first place. She kept Walter Hayes's water-damaged journal in a fireproof box in her office long after the trial ended. Not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder, she said, of what one frightened, dying man's conscience could still accomplish even after every system meant to protect the truth had failed him for years. Grace Miller never accepted Evelyn's repeated, almost desperate attempts to give her enormous sums of money in gratitude. What she did accept eventually, after months of gentle persistence and more than one argument conducted entirely in the carriage house kitchen over cold coffee, was a position running a small non-profit Evelyn funded in her name, the Hayes Miller Foundation, dedicated to supporting homeless veterans and runaway youth across Boston, the very communities Grace had spent years quietly serving with nothing but her own exhausted kindness and whatever change she had in her pockets. The Foundation's first major project was renovating the very shelter on Albany Street where Walter Hayes had once handed out sandwiches every week, installing real beds where cots had been, a proper kitchen, a counselling office, and above the front door a small brass plaque that read simply, "For the ones whose stories aren't finished yet." On a bright Sunday morning the following spring, on a quiet stretch of dock in Camden, Maine, almost exactly 9 years after a 17-year-old girl had once laughed in the sunlight wearing a sapphire necklace, Evelyn Carter clasped that same necklace, fully restored by the original jeweller's surviving apprentice, back around her daughter's throat, her hands no longer shaking the way they had on that sidewalk outside Park Street Station. Olivia's memories were still incomplete, still arriving in fragments some days and floods on others, but her eyes, when she looked at her mother, held something that had been entirely absent in that bookshop in Lisbon: recognition, warmth, and the unmistakable beginning of a life finally fully reclaimed. Grace stood a respectful distance away on the weathered dockboards, smiling, no longer a woman the city had overlooked, but a woman who had quietly, stubbornly, against every reasonable incentive to do otherwise, chosen to keep a promise to a dying stranger, and in doing so had returned a mother her daughter, a daughter her name, and a sleeping city. The long overdue reminder that sometimes the people we walk past without a second glance are carrying, without complaint, the exact truth the whole world has been searching for.